April 1945. Somewhere along a muddy road in western Germany, the war was ending, but for those still wearing Axis uniforms, the fear had not. Columns of prisoners shuffled under a gray sky, their faces hollow, their insignia torn away in shame. Behind them, cities burned. Ahead, rows of American trucks waited beside barbed wire fences. They had been told what to expect, that the Americans were cruel, that capture meant humiliation, starvation, or worse. But as they reached the checkpoint, something strange happened. The guards didn't shout. They offered food. A corporal handed out cigarettes. Another poured black coffee into dented tin cups. Someone even smiled. In that moment, exhaustion turned to disbelief. For men who had fought believing the enemy was inhuman, the real shock came not from defeat, but from mercy. By the spring of 1945, the Axis war machine was collapsing on every front. In the east, the Red Army surged through Poland and into the heart of Germany, leaving a trail of vengeance born from 4 years of brutality. In the west, the American, British, and Canadian armies advanced through the Rhineland, crossing the Rhine River in March, and sweeping toward the Elbe. The German front was broken, its armies fractured, its cities turned to rubble. For the ordinary soldier, surrender had become inevitable. But the question was to whom? Every rumor carried weight. Men who fell into Soviet hands rarely returned. Tales spread of reprisals, executions, and starvation. The only hope, whispered among retreating units, was to reach the Americans or the British before the Russians arrived. As Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe units retreated west, roads became rivers of chaos. Soldiers, nurses, and civilians mixed together in endless columns, moving through bombed-out towns and scorched fields. Some carried rifles, others carried white cloths tied to sticks. For the first time in 6 years, the German army was moving backward, not by command, but by desperation. American field reports noted the change. Capturing entire divisions without firing a shot became routine. At Remagen, when U.S. forces secured the famous bridge, German soldiers surrendered in the thousands. One report from the 80th Infantry Division described lines of prisoners stretching beyond sight, quiet, disciplined, exhausted. But what awaited those prisoners was not what they expected. Nazi propaganda had spent years depicting the Americans as barbaric, a mongrel army of criminals and cowards. Posters warned that captured soldiers would be tortured or enslaved. Yet, as these men entered American custody, they encountered something entirely different: organization, discipline, and even decency. The contrast between expectation and reality would change everything. The U.S. Army in 1945 faced a logistical nightmare: millions of surrendering Axis troops, far more than anyone had anticipated. From Italy to the Netherlands, German, Austrian, and Italian prisoners flooded makeshift enclosures, overwhelming supply lines and manpower. Yet, despite shortages and chaos, the American approach to handling POWs remained rooted in one principle: discipline through humanity. This was not sentimentality, it was policy. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, the United States was legally bound and morally committed to treat prisoners of war with dignity. Every captured soldier was to receive food, shelter, and medical attention equivalent to that of U.S. troops. For American commanders, this was more than law. It was a matter of national character. The war had been fought not only against the Axis armies, but against the ideology that denied human worth. The system that awaited the surrendering Germans reflected that belief. Temporary cages, fenced enclosures built in open fields, processed tens of thousands each week. From there, men were transported to larger, more stable POW camps across Western Germany, France, and even the United States itself. For many prisoners, the shock began the moment they arrived. Instead of beatings or starvation, they found clean rations, medical tents, and orderly registration tables. They were fingerprinted, questioned, deloused, and handed cigarettes. The guards were firm, sometimes cold, but never sadistic. Letters written by German POWs in 1945 revealed the depth of their surprise. One Luftwaffe sergeant held near Andernach wrote home, "We are treated fairly. The guards are polite. It feels strange, after so much hate, to be treated as a man again." Others described meals of bread, coffee, and meat, a luxury compared to what they'd had in the final months of the Reich. It wasn't paradise, far from it. But for men who expected cruelty, the realization hit hard. America had defeated them not only with firepower, but with values. The human angle for the average German soldier. Surrender was more than defeat. It was identity collapse. They had been raised under a regime that preached racial superiority and loyalty unto death. To fall into enemy hands was to betray both the Führer and the myth of invincibility. Yet, as prisoners stepped into American camps, that ideology began to crumble almost instantly. Many were young, barely 20, drafted from schools in the final years of the war. Others were veterans of France, Africa, or Russia, hardened by years of propaganda. But when they met American guards who offered them food instead of fists, the indoctrination faltered. Humanity, once reserved only for Aryans, was now being shown to them by the very men they'd been told were subhuman. Testimonies decades later captured the moment of awakening. A former Wehrmacht corporal recalled, "I thought they would kill us. But when an American gave me his blanket because I was shivering, I realized everything I believed was a lie. It was not just comfort that shocked them, it was the moral reversal." The same soldiers who had been taught to show no mercy now received it from their enemies. They saw American troops joking, writing letters, reading newspapers, reminders of normalcy long erased by Nazi totalitarianism. Some POWs even found themselves envying their captors, not for their strength, but for their freedom. A report from the U.S. Army Provost Marshal noted how discipline among POWs improved the longer they remained in captivity. Theft and violence decreased. Morale stabilized. Prisoners respond positively to structured fairness, it read. The Americans had discovered something unexpected, that dignity was contagious. For the captured Axis soldiers, it was disorienting, yet liberating. They began to see their captors not as conquerors, but as models of a civilization they had been denied. One officer later wrote that his first night in an American camp felt like waking from a nightmare, not because I was free, but because I was finally treated as human. What began as captivity slowly turned into revelation. The moral and cultural angle. True power of America's prisoner policy wasn't just in its organization, it was in its moral contrast. Where the Nazi state had glorified cruelty as strength, the Americans demonstrated that restraint could be stronger still. This quiet moral clarity left a deep imprint on the men who experienced it. Captured officers, many still loyal to the Reich in name, found themselves surrounded not by propaganda, but by ordinary decency. Guards who joked about baseball, shared cigarettes, or played music from camp loudspeakers unknowingly dismantled years of indoctrination. For prisoners who had grown up under a regime that demanded fear and obedience, the casual humanity of their captors was almost incomprehensible. One German lieutenant, interrogated in 1946, admitted, "We saw that Americans treated even their prisoners better than we treated our own people. That realization broke something inside us. The shock wasn't limited to kindness alone. The structure of the camps, order, fairness, freedom within rules, became a living example of democracy in practice. Every man received the same rations regardless of rank. Disciplinary actions were explained, not barked. The hierarchy that had ruled German life evaporated overnight. Some camps even offered lectures, reading materials, and films about democracy and reconstruction. To the astonishment of Allied officers, many POWs attended voluntarily. They were hungry for an alternative to the ideology that had consumed their nation. By late 1945, American intelligence officers noticed a striking pattern. Prisoners exposed to this humane environment became cooperative, even grateful. Some began helping their guards with manual labor, interpreting or rebuilding damaged facilities. Others volunteered to write letters urging remaining German units to surrender peacefully. For many Axis captives, this wasn't merely survival, it was transformation. They had entered captivity believing they were the master race, and left realizing they had been enslaved by lies. What had started as defeat was becoming redemption, not imposed by force, but inspired by example. And soon, that quiet transformation would surface in ways no one expected. When the war was over and the gates of the camps were opened, many of these men would not want to leave. May 1945. The war was finally over. Germany lay in ruins. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. Across Europe, millions of soldiers were disarmed, displaced, and uncertain of what would come next. For the Axis prisoners held in America, this moment, the long-awaited end, arrived not with celebration, but with silence. The American guards came to the camp gates with a list. Names were called. Men were told they would soon be shipped home, first to Europe, then to their devastated homeland. But the reaction wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of cheers, there was hesitation. Instead of joy, murmurs of worry. Some prisoners approached their captors asking to stay just a little longer. A few even begged outright. Reports from the U.S. War Department described it with surprise. A significant number of German prisoners expressed unwillingness to be repatriated. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, one interpreter recalled the scene vividly. When word spread that their transport ships were ready, dozens of POWs lined up, not to board, but to petition. They asked for permission to remain as camp laborers, cooks, even farmhands. They didn't want to return to the rubble that was once home. They had seen newsreel footage of Germany's destruction. Cities flattened, food scarce, families scattered. But more than that, they feared the chaos awaiting them. In the camps, they had structure, food, safety. In America, they had seen a world that functioned. Trains ran on time, stores were full, people lived without fear. Some had developed friendships with local civilians. Farmers who employed them under parole had come to respect their work ethic. Church groups had sent gifts and letters. Children waved to them through fences. To these men, captivity had unexpectedly revealed a vision of what life could be: fair, free, human. And for the first time, they realized that perhaps it was not the Allies who were their enemies, but the ideology that had led them into war. The Americans, puzzled but moved, began to understand. They had conquered more than an army. They had conquered a belief. Across dozens of camps, from Texas to Pennsylvania, the same quiet phenomenon unfolded. The war was over, yet thousands of German and Italian prisoners lingered, not from defiance, but from a strange sense of belonging. At Camp Clinton in Mississippi, one U.S. officer wrote, "These men have seen our schools, our shops, our freedoms, and they compare it to what they knew back home. For them, America has become an idea, not just a place." Letters seized by censors confirmed it. Captives wrote home describing not brutality, but decency. "Here," one prisoner wrote to his wife in Hamburg, "the guards treat us as men, not animals. They give us books and coffee. It makes me ashamed that I ever believed their lies about America." The irony was striking. Men trained to hate the United States now spoke of it with admiration. Many had started studying English. Others attended classes about democracy, agriculture, or engineering. A few even converted their camp time into something meaningful, preparing to rebuild a new, peaceful Germany. But perhaps the most human stories came from the fields and small towns of America's heartland. During harvest seasons, thousands of POWs were sent to work on farms, side by side with American civilians. There, barriers broke in ways propaganda never predicted. Farmers discovered that the enemy shared their humor, their songs, even their exhaustion. Women brought meals to the men in the fields. Children offered candy through wire fences. And the prisoners, moved by such simple kindness, began to see the enemy not as conquerors, but as people. Some were even invited into local homes for Sunday dinners under supervision, a gesture that, by war's standards, bordered on unthinkable. When the time came to leave, tearful goodbyes were exchanged. Families who had lost sons to the war hugged the very men who once wore the uniform of their killers. In that moment, something transcendent happened. Hatred gave way to humanity. The lines between victor and vanquished blurred, and as ships prepared to sail back to Europe, one truth became undeniable. For many Axis prisoners, the most difficult part of captivity wasn't being taken. It was being released. By the summer of 1946, America began the massive task of repatriation. More than 425,000 Axis prisoners had been held across the United States, from Arizona deserts to New England forests. Now, one by one, they were sent home aboard crowded Liberty ships. Yet, as the transports departed from New York, Norfolk, and New Orleans, American officers noted an astonishing pattern. Many of the departing men left with tears in their eyes. Some saluted their guards in respect. Others left handwritten notes of gratitude. A few even vowed to return, not as soldiers, but as citizens. For countless German prisoners, America had become a mirror of what their own country could be: free, industrious, fair. And that realization would shape the future more than anyone expected. When they reached Germany, the shock was overwhelming. The cities were ashes. Millions were displaced. Food was rationed to the edge of starvation. The prisoners who had seen the abundance and order of the United States now stood amid ruins that told the story of a dictatorship's failure. But those who had experienced American treatment carried something with them: a new belief in dignity, democracy, and humanity. Many of these former POWs became part of Germany's post-war recovery, joining efforts to rebuild a nation stripped of hate. U.S. intelligence reports later confirmed it. Exposure to democratic ideals during captivity had profoundly influenced the mindset of thousands. In fact, several post-war German leaders, politicians, engineers, educators, once wore prisoner uniforms in American camps. What had started as mercy on the battlefield was quietly becoming a foundation for peace. As the months passed, the effects of this unexpected education through humanity rippled across the Atlantic. In towns and farms across America, civilians remembered the former prisoners not as enemies, but as men who worked hard, respected rules, and left a mark of quiet gratitude. Letters continued to arrive, written in careful English, thanking American families for kindness, for warmth, for dignity. Some former POWs even returned years later, now as immigrants. They found work in the same communities where they had once labored behind fences. Farmers welcomed them back as friends. One Texas farmer, interviewed in 1953, recalled, "They came back not to conquer, but to contribute." For the United States, the humane treatment of prisoners became a moral victory that extended far beyond the battlefield. It stood in sharp contrast to the atrocities committed in Axis camps, reinforcing the democratic ideal that true strength lies in restraint. The Geneva Convention had demanded fair treatment. America, in many cases, had gone beyond it, offering Nisu not only food and safety, but dignity and understanding. And in doing so, the nation demonstrated something the world needed to see after years of darkness: that freedom was not merely a political system, but a way of treating others, even one's enemies. By the early 1950s, historians began to notice a striking legacy. Many of the former POWs had become advocates for Western cooperation, supporting the creation of democratic West Germany and its alliance with the United States. Their admiration for America had turned into partnership, a bond built not from conquest, but compassion. The guns had fallen silent, the flags had changed, but what endured was the memory of a simple truth: that mercy can rebuild what war destroys. In the grand chronicle of war, battles are counted in bodies and borders, but sometimes the quietest victories echo the longest. For the Axis prisoners who crossed the ocean in chains, America revealed something their regimes never could: the power of humanity over hate. They came expecting vengeance and found fairness. They anticipated cruelty and received kindness. And in those moments, over shared cigarettes, warm meals, or the sound of laughter through camp fences, the foundations of a new world were being laid. Many of those men would return home forever changed. Some rebuilt Germany's towns. Others raised children who believed in democracy, not dictatorship. Their transformation became a silent testament that compassion, even in war, can alter history. The Americans never set out to re-educate their prisoners, yet by living their ideals, they did. And in doing so, they proved that the greatest victory of all is to defeat hatred without becoming it.